Go for it if you don't mind.
No, not at all.
Great. Wonderful.
Well, maybe just to mention real quickly that we also are live streaming here, and there are, going to be some people joining us on live stream from all over the world. So.
Great. They may know a lot of things that Amir and I don't know. So, welcome to IPS. Some of you are interns, and some of you are former interns, and some of you are regulars. So it's great to have you all here. The Institute for Policy Studies is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And one of the constants of our work here has been paying attention to the World Bank and IMF and the international financial institutions. So we're especially pleased to be doing this. And Amira will say a little bit about herself in a moment, but she has a long history of work on these institutions. Before coming to IPS about a decade ago, she worked with both Oxfam and Interaction and has extensive experience in Africa and in other parts of the world, so has worked on these institutions from many different standpoints. And I'm John Cavanna, and I came to IPS 30 years ago to direct a global economy project, and starting in the 1980s worked on the third world debt crisis that the IMF was a central player in. And since then, Amira and I and others at IPS have been involved in activities around the World Bank. I was just reading in the Washington Post today, there was a big piece on the World Bank. I don't know how many of you saw it, but it mentioned that the current president, Jim Kim, came to some events that we were involved in 20 years ago under the rubric of a coalition called 50 Years is Enough. That referred to 20 years ago, these two institutions were 50, and we had a number of activities that were suggesting that they were outmoded, that they needed to change. And it was fascinating to read that the current president of the World Bank participated in those. So we've divided things up a bit here. I'm going to say a word just about their creation, and then Amira is going to say something about the model that they came to embrace, their governance, their role in the global south. I'll say a word about them in the current crisis, especially in Europe. Amira will say something about the people's movements that we've all been part of to reform them, and then we'll look forward. We most recently were very involved in the struggle over the naming of new heads of both the IMF and World Bank. We were involved in attempts to try to democratize that process, and we can say a word about that. And I guess I would just, maybe we can pause at points in the conversation, Amira, and just invite people to come in, because there's definitely some expertise in the room on these institutions, and who knows, we might get something wrong, and you can correct us. So let me, if I could, I'll just start and say a word about their origins, and then we'll shift over to Amira. Just one thing to frame who these two institutions are, and it sort of give you a sense of our work at IPS, which is that I think our approach to a lot of our work here is to try to get a handle on the institutions that set the rules, that have a big influence on people and the planet. And we at IPS interact with those entities, both public and private, at the local and national and international levels. And over the last 50 years or so, we would, I think, argue that two of the institutions that have had the biggest impact on most people, on a large number of people's lives, are the World Bank and IMF. And they were household names in the mid-1990s to early 2000s because of a global justice movement, and many students, everyone kind of knew who they were, and they have faded a bit more into obscurity. So I think we really wanted to have this session because we still think they're vital, and just to give you a little bit of a sense of them. So their origins. They were founded 70 years ago. They were founded out of conversations that took place during World War II. Both came into being in the 1944 to 1945 period, right as World War II was ending. And I think the important thing just to say about their origins that is important, it's a little bit in the theme of 50 years is enough, is one, keep in mind they're 70 years old. They were set up, and their governance still somewhat reflects a world that is 70 years old. The governments that came together near the place where I grew up, they were founded in a place called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The people who were there reflected the colonial world of the time. It was largely the rich countries that were at the founding conference. It was largely actually a negotiation between the US and the British, and it reflected what was in their minds. And just to think back, there were two big things in their mind at the time. One was World War II, where many parts of the world had been devastated. A lot of it was Europe that had been devastated. And in the original notion of the World Bank, a lot of people thought it would be key to the reconstruction of Europe. In the end, the US government set up the Marshall Plan and the World Bank played less of a role. And the other thing that was in everybody's mind is we had just come out of the Great Depression, a time when there was a lot of fighting among nations. A lot of nations put up tariff barriers against each other as different countries' economies descended into depression. And so part of what was on the minds of people was setting up new institutions that could help prevent that in the future. So there was very much of a so-called, I mean, to use a term that is overused, but a free trade mentality, a notion that more open trade and financial flows among nations would be good, would help prevent another depression. And in the minds of the founders would be three pillars. We're going to focus on two, but one that would deal with production and helping reconstruct countries and helping to come up with financing mechanisms for production. That would be the World Bank. One that would deal with finance and the financing of the exchange of goods around the world and the rules that would set that, the IMF. And the third that would deal with trade, something that was called at that time the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And just to lead you into Amira, I would say their first 20 years were not that interesting. I mean, I hate to put it that way. They weren't that key institutions, in part because of the role the US was playing in the world, and in part because it was the 50s and 60s and even 70s were a time of many different development models. It was sort of a time of letting 1,000 flowers bloom. There were socialist nations, there were social democratic nations, there were democratic nations, there were dictatorships. There were many different models of development, from the Arusha villages of Tanzania to, well, just many different kinds of development models, a lot of import substitution and protectionism. It was an exciting time to be studying development. And the bank and fund reflected that. But there wasn't that much action. They didn't lend that much money. However, their role changes around 1980, and so we'll shift over to Amira for the emergence of a more dominant development model.
Well, John is always a joy to be on a panel with because he has such a depth of knowledge and expertise and information. But we are all really grateful that all of you are here, that you're interested, and that those that are joining online are also with us. And we recognize the potential of having this kind of chronicle of these institutions, not only for those of us that are gathering today, but so that people can access it in the days, months, and years to come as well. So we thank you for carving out time and being here. But as John was saying, yes, there was a proliferation of economic models at one time, and then what you had was almost a privileging of an economic model that many of us we vacillate from calling it the Washington Consensus to the neoliberal model, but essentially it's an economic model that says, cut the size of governments, get governments out of the way, let the markets do their thing, and all will be well. And things will trickle down to those in lower classes, and somehow you will have adjustments of the global economy if you get governments out of the way. So there was a big push in this model to have limited government, limited regulation. Sounds like discussions that are still happening right now in Washington, right? It's not something that is only being prescribed internationally. It is still a debate that is very much alive and well here in the U.S. What is the role of governments? What should be the role of governments, particularly in providing services for their people? But essentially, this model said that in order for countries to advance, deregulate, and also get rid of capital controls. Don't constrict in any way the ability for funds to flow in and out of your country. The assumption is that if you get rid of governments, get rid of regulations, and get rid of capital controls, that foreign direct investment, foreign corporations coming into your country will be the way to alleviate poverty, will be the way to help people raise their standards of living. And so the push really was to ignore the service needs of citizens within your country, to ignore the democratic process even, and to let the market dominate all. Right? So the notion that foreign direct investment was the path to advancement, to economic well-being, to economic prosperity, it's a notion that has been since, tremendously debunked. But it also went along with really an idea that there will be preferences within the global economy, that there are some who can do certain assets better than others. So for example, if you have large agricultural companies, whether it's Monsanto or AGM or Cargill, that they could do better at providing food, essentially, for developing countries, and whether the country was Haiti or elsewhere in this hemisphere or somewhere in other parts of the world, that actually importing food may be better for your economy because it is cheaper to have corporations essentially from the US and Europe to be able to provide those services for your population. So get rid of any support to farmers, get rid of any subsidies to farmers in developing countries, and instead create a space where there can be essentially a dumping of goods on your markets because it would be cheaper to import, to pay for food to be brought to your country than it would be to actually support your farmers in feeding their own neighbors and communities and the rest of the country and the region. So there was an assumption in this model that if the market did its thing, all will be well for farmers, for workers, for the environment. And I think what we have seen over time is that that model has been largely debunked, especially for Africa and Latin America and Asia. So basically for much of the world, right? But essentially what you have had is a governance structure within these institutions, both the World Bank and the IMF, that has continued to perpetuate an economic model in spite of the fact that the model has failed, right? So when we talk about the governance of these institutions, it's ironic. Back at the Bretton Woods days, the institutions were actually envisioned as being a part of a UN system and were set up as that, but then quickly became these independent power brokers on their own. So what you have is a UN that is essentially one country, one vote. Okay, we can talk about the Security Council. It's not a perfect model, but the notion of one country, one vote. And you have these international financial institutions, extremely powerful institutions, where, guess what? $1, one vote. The wealthy countries dominate the decision-making, dominate the agenda setting. And if you are a country that happened to have been dominant after World War II, France, Germany, England, you would have one executive director representing your country. Clearly the US as well has one executive director representing their interests. But for regions, particularly regions where, like Africa, there were in 1945 2 countries that were independent in Africa. Now they're 54, right? So 52 countries didn't exist when the bank was created, only 2. And guess what the representation for Africa at the World Bank is today? 2 executive directors representing a continent of 54 countries, right? So the imbalance in the governing structure is clear, and it has perpetuated this notion that one model, in spite of the failures, particularly in the global south, that one model should be sustained above all else. So when we talk about the dominance of the institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, it is often their dominance in the global south that's of concern. And I think clearly, when you think about countries around the world, whether it's Democratic Republic of the Congo or El Salvador, Brazil, the countries are many that are rich in resources. Rich in resources. And yet what you have had is a systematic undermining of the ability of countries to use their own resources to generate the necessary wealth within their countries to be able to provide for the needs and services of their own populations. So essential services, whether it's healthcare or education or electricity, telecommunications, were all privatized under the World Bank IMF economic model. Were all essentially sold off to the highest bidder, to a corporate entity, often a foreign corporate entity, right? While the resources of the countries were being extracted at incredibly unequal rates. So what you had was a system of extraction, almost like a giant vacuum machine, vacuuming up the resources of countries and stripping away the ability of governments to even tax corporations that were involved in those extractive industries. So the ability of governments to generate resources through taxation was taken away, and increasingly the ease of transferring those resources out through foreign direct investors were enhanced. So it's almost like a double whammy, right? Countries being stymied in terms of the ability to actually meet the needs of their own citizens. Of course, we can talk about all the issues around commodity prices and how commodity prices are set often outside the countries where those resources lie, but essentially countries unable to survive with foreign currency now dominated by US dollars, right? Now having to go increasingly since 1970s, late 70s, 80s, and since then repeatedly to the World Bank, to the International Monetary Fund to generate resources that they aren't able to get from if they were able to create or to actually assess and access the rents at a proper level of their own natural resources. So I think it is critical to understand the dominant role that these institutions play. Often, governments are more responsive to the interests of the World Bank or the IMF and the demands of those institutions than their own parliaments and legislatures. It is actually stripping away the democratic process increasingly in this 21st century, when there are even more demands being made for good governance, for democracy, for people's participation throughout the world. So we're coming at this conversation at a critical time, and I think it's really important to recognize the grip that these institutions have had on countries throughout the world. I think it's also important to understand that it isn't only the global south, and we can, but also Europe and the US, all countries essentially that are under this regime, that are actually creating this imbalance where corporate interests, market interests are led to dominate decision-making on an economic model that's not serving the needs of the majority of the people.
Yeah, I mean, and let me just add one quick thing to the part that Amira just said, and then let's see if you have any questions and comments now at this stage, and then we'll come up to the present. I feel like these two institutions have had sort of two different periods, roughly equal, and Amira just did a really nice description, I feel, of this current one. But the turning point, it's important to say something about the turning point. The first 35 years, so 1945 to 1980, many models of development. And some interesting things going on in the UN, the creation of the UN Conference on Trade and Development that I worked at in the late 70s, pushing many different models. The turning point for these institutions was 1980. 1980 is the election of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who people are now mourning in different ways all around the world. But those two come in with a strong platform of free markets, of austerity, of the whole philosophy that Amira just described. And the World Bank in 1980 changes how it works in a fundamental way and starts giving policy-based loans. It gives its first loans, which are called structural adjustment loans, which are loans where countries get money in exchange for a set of policy changes that Amira has just described. And it also stepped up sector lending, like to agriculture, again with policy conditions along the lines of what Amira described. So it becomes a player with a lot more power in a world where countries need money. The IMF has always been this way, but it has always given policy-based lending in exchange for countries agreeing to policy changes. But both of them become much bigger, much more powerful, more resources, and focused around a single model that is reinforcing what Ronald Reagan is doing in the United States, Margaret Thatcher is doing in England, Helmut Kohl is doing in Germany, and you have a giant paradigm shift in the world since 1980. Part of what makes today so exciting and getting into the resistance and into the crisis is that I think we feel that we're in a shift. Amira just said that model's been discredited, yet it clearly still has power. We just had a friend here this morning, Nick Papandreou, whose brother was just the Prime Minister of Greece, and he just wanted to talk about the IMF. So that they're still very strong, but it's a moment of great debate. And Jim Kim and Christine Lagarde, the new leaders of these two institutions, came in with a different rhetoric. They came in with a rhetoric of wanting to change and move away from a dominant model. But we're 33 years into what Amira just described. It's well entrenched. It's a set of largely neoclassical economists at these two institutions who view the world the way Amira just described. They aren't development experts. They aren't civil society experts. They aren't peasant farmers. They're people who've been trained in a way of thinking which has been destructive in all the ways that Amira just stated. So, any comments or questions at this stage in the game here? You know, so so the question was what role did the creation of the WTO in 1995 have on this and the U.S. and other nations joining it? I mean, I'm sure if we could each take a stab at that. For me, the trade regime of so we started with the three, the World Bank, the IMF, and GATT. GATT, too, didn't have a lot of powers. It was trying to arrange the slow reduction of tariffs around the world, but it didn't have that much power. The creation of the WTO in 1995 was, in a sense, the trade regime catching up with where the World Bank and IMF had come since 1980. They were 15 years late, but it was coming in, giving huge new powers to a global trade body and giving it powers over not just trade, but trade and investment flows. So it becomes a complement to the structural adjustment, free trade, neoliberal model that Amira has just described, with now the power of trade sanctions on countries which are deviating from the model. And so for most of us, it was seen as, in very negative terms, and as something which was reinforced. The one difference, so Amira just described the governance of the World Bank and IMF. The only difference with the WTO, which we all feel is much better, is it is governed, at least on paper, the way Amira described the UN. It's one nation, one vote. And right now they're going through a fascinating process that I bet none of you are paying attention to because it's not in the newspapers. They're picking their new head. And in theory, they started with 9 candidates, all neoclassically trained people with that view of the world. It's disgusting, these 9 candidates. And they're now down to 5, and then they're going to get it down to 2, and it is done through a consensus process of where, in theory, each nation gets a vote. It's being done, though, behind closed doors in secret. How they got from 9 to 5, I don't know. But the one we're most watching out for, I just want to say, is we fought at IPS strongly in the 1990s, the creation of the first big regional trade agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The Mexican negotiator for it was a guy named Blanco. He was a minister at the time. He was more free trade than Ronald Reagan. And he is one of the lead candidates. He's one of the final five. So just as we led a campaign against Larry Summers being the head of the World Bank in this last round, our Mexican allies are leading a campaign to make sure that Herminio Blanco is not the next head of the WTO. He is the worst among equals, unfortunately. But do you want anything to add on the WTO?
In terms of the WTO, one of the interesting elements, and it's chronicled here on this wall, beautifully done by Andy Shalal here, is that, the WTO created an opening for incredible inside-outside action. And I think we often talk about it in those terms here at IPS, right? Change happens with those who are pressuring levers from within institutions and systems, but it's also the outside pressure, the street heat, the heat of movements, right? And the pressure of movements that has brought change throughout history. So the WTO represents an incredible turning point where global civil society, social movements were able to come together in Seattle with governments, particularly governments in the global south, that had a different vision of the needs of their countries. And an incredible space was created, a nexus was made between governments of the global south and social movements here in the US and throughout the world to pressure change within the WTO. Now, change is minimal when it comes to the WTO, so let's be clear on that. But many of us saw it significant that what the WTO was calling their developmental round, which means that they would have a system of negotiations and dialogue to put development issues first in their agenda, that, even that developmental round incredibly failed, and there was no consensus reached because of the pressure of governments from the global south saying, no, this is not in our interest. So I think you're increasingly finding ways in which governments are using their leverage to demand a different economic model. And I think it is important for us to acknowledge that. It is that coming together of governments, especially governments seeking the needs and interests of their people, listening to their people, right, and social movements that will be able to move any of these institutions in a direction that protects people and protects the planet in the long run. So I'm not saying it's all glaringly wonderful news, but I do think that there have been some examples of incredible wins, particularly in issues where developing countries have asserted their influence.
Yeah, and just to, Amira was pointing, just so you all can see, it's the turtles up there on the top is the famous march in November of 1999. That's Teamsters joining Turtles. It was sort of a labor, environment, women, faith, and so on at the big summit of the WTO in Seattle, where inside, governments of the Caribbean, small African nations stood up and said, we don't like where this is going. And on the outside, 65,000 people marched, 5,000 of them locked down the streets. The meeting was in the end shut down, the round stopped. It was an inside-outside strategy. There's a Hollywood movie about it called Battle in Seattle with Woody Harrelson and Charlize Theron that captures a little bit of it. I would have done it differently, but that's, it's a great moment in terms of social movements coming together with allies and government. Anything else?
Another question?
Yeah. Young woman in the back there.
I have a couple of questions, and I just want to say thank you so much for
The wonderful question is, why follow a model that's failed? And
acknowledge that it's
and that they've acknowledged has failed. And I think the short answer is there are a lot of interests at stake, and they are largely corporate interests. You know, you have a network of finance that has been sustained through this process. So if you think about all of this, what many of us call, you know, crony capitalism, right? It's a wonderful way of thinking of it as a house of cards that has collapsed. But essentially, there are many people who benefited, often those on Wall Street's international bankers, those in London and other key financial markets have benefited tremendously. But it's ironic, there are times when you realize that there's some hidden beneficiaries that you don't even recognize, right? So, you know, one issue when we talk about trade and the dumping of agricultural products in the global South, well, you have a shipping company that has tremendously benefited from that process, in spite of the fact that it has decimated economies along the way. But you have these interests that have benefited and have a stake in this, right? And I think it is critical for us to also to understand the power, particularly of U.S. and European, corporations, those that have benefited, whether in the banking sector or in the agricultural sector or in the shipping sector, have played a role in lobbying their members of Congress, in lobbying their executive directors, in making sure that the system continues to serve their narrow interests. So that 1% that we talk about so beautifully after Occupy, right? The 1% controls and wields a lot of power, and sometimes its hand, it seems almost invisible. But if you just move the curtain, you know, it's like the Wizard of Oz, just remove the curtain, you recognize that there are a lot of interests at play. They have garnered billions along the way over these decades, and they want to continue to serve their narrow interests, essentially at the expense of the majority of people on the planet, and also at the expense of destroying the environment of the planet as well.
Yeah, and maybe just add a thing, and this was one of the things I was going to put in the next thing anyway, but just that gets to Emily's questions, is in terms of why, yeah, they still follow a failed model, and is there a new development model? So World Bank President Jim Kim announced a new doctrine yesterday of shifting the World Bank to focus on the issues of the bottom 40% of humanity. It's sort of a Occupy, as Mike walks in the room, an Occupy Wall Street agenda here, it sounds like, by Jim Kim. And what will it mean? Now, so here, just to say a little bit about the battles of the last year, the heads of both the World Bank and IMF come up for a shift. On the IMF, the disgraced last head is caught in the sex scandal in New York, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the French socialist, and in the World Bank's case, it's the regular succession. So now here we have 70 years of the gentleman's agreement in this beautiful hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where they say, okay, you Europeans, you get to pick the IMF head, we Americans will pick the World Bank head of a global institution. 70 years later, we have now 196 countries in the world. The bulk of them are developing. They are at the center of the mandates of these two institutions. 70 years later, there is still a gentleman's agreement that the IMF will be headed by a European and the World Bank by an American, yet it's beginning to be shaken. It's a harder and harder thing to justify, and yet you just watch, like the Obama administration, we get to pick the World Bank president. So just to give a tiny bit of the shakeup, because I think it offers some openings. With the IMF, people were screaming, shouting, and for the first time, one of the candidates that emerged, there was a horrible neoliberal central bank governor from Mexico, and there was this very classy-looking French finance minister with this cool haircut, and who had come out in favor of one of our big things that was also there in Occupy Wall Street. Wall Street tax, a financial speculation tax, call it what you will, financial speculation tax. And she was picked. So pressure, citizen pressure clearly helped influence that. And then on the World Bank, you know, the name of Larry Summers is floated. Two groups did a big petition campaign. 100,000 people signed a petition saying no to Larry Summers, this sexist, blah, blah, blah. And so his name disappears. Then another American self-appoints himself as a candidate, Jeffrey Sachs, with the backing of, he gets 6 countries, 6 smaller countries where he's done his Millennium Villages and his other magic in the developing world, and they say, we want Jeffrey Sachs. He says, I'm great. I'm a candidate from the South. And he's confusing. Even, I'm sure, among all of you, there's probably different views. We at IPS thought he'd be a very bad president, and Amira and I and others, we did a debate with actually Jeffrey Sachs and the Nation on why we didn't think he'd be a good head. And then a really cool thing happened, which is that 2 developing countries stood up, and I mean, they didn't stand up. I mean, 2 candidates came forward from developing countries. One was former agriculture minister from Colombia, who was actually, you know, more in our view of the world. And then a former finance minister from Nigeria who'd also been at the World Bank, who was more in the Jeffrey Sachs vision of the world. But all of a sudden there were challengers who weren't American. And my sense of what happened in the Obama had actually interviewed 8 people for an hour and a half for this position. Most of them, again, white men. So all white men for 70 years in these 2 institutions. But there were 2 people of color on his list. One who slipped in because he'd been the president of Dartmouth, which is Timothy Geithner's college. So Jim Kim. And the other was a woman who was the president, the CEO of Pepsi, who would have been more like the Nigerian finance minister, and Jeffrey Sachs. And they picked Jim Kim. I think, again, Timothy Geithner blinded. The ideology of Dartmouth is stronger than the ideology of neoliberalism. And Hillary Clinton had met Jim Kim with Paul Farmer in Haiti and liked him. So they pushed him. He becomes the president. And we're thinking, well, a physician who's worked in Haiti and who's taken on pharmaceutical companies is becoming the head of the World Bank. And I'm curious, Amira, where you, I mean, reading just the last few days, and it's, you know, so I read just reading what they're announcing today. I love it that they say they're going to focus on the bottom 40%, but it is cloaked in the language of the neoliberal model. Just as Christine Lagarde has become a defender of austerity and the neoliberal model in Europe. It's funny, you take these good people, you stick them on top of institutions that are still primarily neoclassically trained economists and who view the world through that lens. And can these 2 people have much of an influence? And I think part of our role as civil society is to push them to stand, you know, to stand up for what they said they were for going in, to remind them of their past. But neither of them is blowing me away so far in their first months.
Well, and I think, you know, this is a longer-term project. This is why I love being at IPS, because you don't only look at the short time horizon, but, you know, in the spirit of Mark Raskin, our founder, we take like the 50 and 100-year horizon, right? So I think our efforts now have to be focused, and that's why I'm so grateful that Lacey was inspired to convene this session. You know, because the session was made to reach out to you all, young people, you know, our interns and students, right? Because I think ultimately we need young economists that are going to stand up and demand an economic model that works for real people, right? You can't just look at the numbers and ignore the people, ignore the reality on the ground, right? And also ignore that the model has failed. So what we ultimately need is a cadre of young, brilliant economists that are willing to go against the grain and to stand together and stand firm to begin to actually put in place new economic models. And I think, you know, at moments like a World Social Forum, which just happened in Tunisia, there are gatherings of these progressive economists. They come together and, you know, but ultimately it's not sustained. We have to continue to build that movement. So it's working with academics to make sure that there are resources going to grad students who are interested in demanding a different way in terms of the global economy. and putting their lives, their research, their academic credentials on the line to make that happen. Ultimately, it's up to you all, right? It's up to you all to create a generation of new economists that will be able to stand against a model that has failed. And that's why ultimately I applaud Occupy, because I really think that Occupy changed a conversation, not just in the US, but really around the world, as did uprisings in Tunisia, in Egypt, and really in countries in so many places we can't even begin to list right now. I think we have to use that momentum to revision our financial institutions at all levels, to begin to understand the importance of visioning an economic model that puts the needs of workers first, not exploitation of workers for corporate profit, but the needs of workers first, that acknowledges the critical impact of the environment, of economic activity, and factors that into how the economic model is derived, that underscores a role for governments to actually provide essential services to their people. It is ultimately those fundamentals that will bring about a new economic order that actually works in the interests of the majority on the planet. So ultimately, it's up to you all, right? I think it's not going to be the heads of these institutions. It's going to be people power, both outside and within these institutions, making change happen. We could speak endlessly on that. So the question is on the role of the elites in countries in the global south. And, I'm from Liberia, so I feel like the examples there come so readily to mind. But if you think about that one example in Liberia essentially was one of the two countries that was independent at the time of Bretton Woods, but wasn't invited to the party, by the way, right?
Ethiopia was independent.
Yeah, it was about the only one.
South Africa.
Yeah.
Sorry?
South Africa.
Yeah, if you look at the photos from Bretton Woods, you see a proud Ethiopian face.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to remember as maybe
What
the
about
only.
South Africa? It was not
Well, we can
Right.
talk about that, right? In terms of,
I think it was a
white rule.
Yes, it
Under
was white.
apartheid,
Yeah,
right?
so I think
It
the
was
only
apartheid.
Right.
non-white
Right.
face was
Right.
an Ethiopian. I think in Bretton Woods.
So, but the issue is that you have had, first, governments excluded and the role of governments undermined, the size of governments undercut, but you have also had a complicity, right? So what you had in Liberia in 1979 was essentially an opening up of the finance ministry. So we talked about commodity prices dropping. Commodity prices dropped in the 1970s. In the case of Liberia, it's iron ore, the economy is heavily dependent on iron ore and gold and diamonds, but the price of the commodities dropped in the 1970s. And so Liberia went to the international financial institutions in the late 70s to negotiate a loan. So essentially, instead of looking to how to, again, tax these tax corporations that are coming in and investing in the resources, looking externally for loans of the institutions was essentially the route taken. So the Liberian Finance Ministry was essentially opened up, carte blanche given to these advisors, right, that came in and essentially set up shop in the finance ministry. And what you had almost immediately after they entered the country was a decision to do away with subsidies to farmers. Liberia had been a rice producer, but the assumption was you can get rice, PL 480, right, from the U.S., and you don't need your farmers to grow the rice. Don't subsidize those farmers, import the rice, right? So almost immediately, by April just seems like such a momentous month always, right? But it was April 1979. The immediate result of the removal of those subsidies to farmers was the increase in the price of rice, which led to rice riots, right? People essentially rioting in the streets because they could not afford to put food on the table to feed their children, right? And, we can go and more into that, but a year later there was a coup which led to a 26-year period of war, right? So you had, in that 26-year period of war, a very steady relationship with the IMF and the World Bank. Almost open access, even during the war, even under Charles Taylor, in spite of how he's now the international pariah, right? Loans were given to these elites, often dictators. We call them odious debts, right? Because it's the debt accrued under Samuel Doe, who essentially led the country from 1980 for about a decade with IMF support, with U.S. bilateral support. And essentially what he was doing was using loans from the IMF to buy weapons, to buy weapons from the U.S., to build a machinery of repression that killed 250,000 people. Right? The World Bank, the IMF, and the U.S. bilaterally were implicitly involved. But there was a local elite that made it happen. You're absolutely right. But I think it is critical to understand the role played by these external actors for their own narrow interests. Another example that comes to mind is, Mobutu. We talk a lot now about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? The DR Congo, again, gained independence back in 1960. A liberation leader, Patrice Lumumba, led the way to independence, right? And what happened, he wasn't going the way of the model, right? He had come from a trade union background, was wanting to put the interests of workers first. And folks said, oh, no. Cold War period, he's going to go the side of the Soviets. He was assassinated. Complicit in that was the US and the UK. It's now pretty much open information, easily accessible everywhere, right? Lumumba was assassinated. Put in his place was Mobutu. Mobutu kept in place for almost 40 years, 38 years, propped up, got more support from the World Bank, and this is also beautifully, in so many books documented. Mobutu got more resources from the World Bank than basically all of the other governments outside from South Africa, perhaps, combined, because he was seen as doing their bidding. Okay? So the local elites are there, and they have done irresponsible, reprehensible acts, but they are actually doing the bidding of the international financial institutions. And ultimately, you need to address the crisis on both ends, at the level of the international institutions, as well as the elites that are serving their narrow, very limited self-interests.
Yeah, and just one thing to add that was part of those stories that I watched here in the 1980s was the World Bank and IMF had training institutes. They would bring government officials from these countries here and give them their bigger picture. And I spent a lot of time in the 1980s in the Philippines, and my wife wrote a PhD dissertation on the World Bank and IMF in the Philippines at this time when they were a guinea pig for these structural adjustment loans I mentioned. And she watched these government officials come and be trained and in a sense become almost more gung-ho than even the World Bank IMF people in this ideology. So it wasn't, by the late 80s, it wasn't, and this was under a dictatorship, so very similar to Amira's story. This was the Marcos dictatorship, pouring money in, but with technocrats who became as gung-ho as the neoclassical economists here. Now, it's not to say that everybody was brainwashed in developing country governments. I remember going with a mayor of a southern city in the Philippines into the World Bank in the mid-80s, and he was saying, we don't want this loan, we don't want your loans. And the World Bank looked at this guy and looked at us and said, we can't deal with you. In the end, they just said, you're a mayor, we deal with the national government, sorry. Or, more recently, last year, the IMF is in Greece saying, you must do austerity, you must do austerity. And the Greek government of George Papandreou, with a lot of popular support, saying, we don't want to do austerity. And he even said, I would like to have a popular referendum in this country about this, to which the German, Merkel and the European Central Bank said, no, you won't. But it's not that the domestic elites are always piping in and accepting, but in most cases they've been trained, they went to the same schools, they're part of the same thinking, and when people challenge it, or now in whole countries, in Latin America, the Bolivians, the Ecuadorians, the Venezuelans, the Argentines, they're challenging it. And it's great, and I would say that the big difference maybe between the 80s and 90s and now is those countries are just they are free of the World Bank and IMF. They're not getting any money from them. The Argentines were helped by the Venezuelans and the Brazilians in buying their independence from these institutions. And so you do have countries that are freed of them, who've in essence quit the whole game, and the price they pay is that they are no longer eligible for money from these institutions.
And not only are they not eligible for money from the institutions, but if you don't get money from the institutions, you also cut yourself out of opportunities in the private sector markets. So, you have to get the stamp of approval if you want to go to the private sector. So even if you don't need the money from the institutions, many countries decide that they want the private sector financing as well. And so I think it's a double-edged sword where these institutions are holding leverage not only for what they're giving directly, but also for their stamp of approval for these other international markets.
Central America? Yes. Yeah. Central America is under Monsanto.
Monsanto.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they get a miserable salary.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just one thing on that, because for the present, the last 5 years have also been shifted by not just Occupy, and Amira is going to say a little bit more about the social movements in a minute, but there have been big crises on farming, on finance, and on environment, on climate. So anywhere in the world, if you ask most people what's going on in the last 5 years, they will mention one of those crises. And Amira mentioned the whole farming model that has Monsanto at the center that has been so oppressive. But I guess I do feel that each of those crises have further, it gets back to what Emily was saying, they further delegitimized the overall approach in that people are seeing them fail on all three counts. I actually think, Amira started with food, and you mentioned Monsanto. I think the food systems are the Achilles heel of the whole thing, because we've had 3 giant food price crises from 2008, 2011, 2012, where what Amira described, this huge import dependence now of most countries on imports in a volatile global markets filled with speculation, has really awakened a lot of prime ministers, a lot of governments. In 2011, I visited El Salvador, Trinidad, and the Philippines, all of them going through horrible food crises, all of them with kind of interesting governments, more open to other ways of thinking, and all of them came out of that saying, we need an agricultural system that has got some controls against the Monsantos of the world, that is supporting sustainable agriculture, that is trying to reduce imports. And of course, and the production of food is still what employs or gives livelihood to the most people in the world. Its crisis, in some ways, I think can be a catalyst to more countries moving in the direction of the Latin American countries that we just mentioned. You wanted.
They do really good research. They actually know what works and what doesn't work, but there's this disconnect between the way the programs are developed and implemented and the people they're intended to serve. And I was just wondering what you think about that.
It's really interesting. There is this Africa Staff Association, and there are a number of staff associations. And when you talk to people individually, or even sometimes in those staff associations, you get a whole different take than the model that's projected of these institutions. So I think your question about those internal to the institution that have a different ethos, I think it's very real. I think there have been some within the institutions that have brought changes, for example, on issues of gender and gender rights and gender inclusion. The institutions have still a long ways to go, don't get me wrong, but people with those sensitivities have been able to do some say cosmetic, but still some reforms. Some say the environment, but that's a trickier area, where, because of people pressuring outside as well as inside the institution, a commitment was made to do a study of the role of the World Bank in the extractive industries. A report was done, recommendations were made, and then it's almost as if it was forgotten. Right? So I think ultimately you have some well-intentioned people, but within a system where they're getting paid tremendous amounts of money to maintain a system. And, tremendous amounts of money, all tax-free, is a pretty big incentive to keep quiet and keep putting the money out the door, right? And I think ultimately, one of the examples that comes to mind is Chad, right? Chad, because it's an oil-producing country, has this privileged relationship with the World Bank, in spite of the fact that it's pretty clear that the president, Deby, is essentially using money from the World Bank loans to again, buy weapons to maintain his power. Chad has continued and is still today. The Chad-Cameroon pipeline, oil pipeline, is today the largest infrastructure project on the African continent, very, funded, made possible by the World Bank and IMF funding. So I think, there are people who within the institutions know, okay, we should have learned the examples of Mobutu and Samuel Doe and all the others, but the process, it almost gives greater recognition and applauds them, commends them for getting more money out the door in spite of the fact that it's a failed policy and it is propping up causing more harm in countries around the world, right? So I think there is this narrow incentive that sustains it, which is unfortunate, but I think people have been able to essentially say, well, I'll just do this for a couple of years and then I'll go out and do something else, right? But essentially have continued to reinforce the status quo.
I had just one incident, and then go here, that reinforced what Amira just said. IPS a year ago set up every Wednesday, we'd go down and leaflet the World Bank from 8 to 9 in the morning as people were coming in over something we were very upset about, which is that the World Bank houses a tribunal that hears trade and investment cases, and called the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. It's part of the World Bank Group, and it was given more power in trade agreements to allow corporations to sue governments. And there's some big mining companies suing the government of El Salvador right now. And so we were there to protest. Actually, I handed a leaflet to the then head of the World Bank, Robert Zoellick, in that period. But we talked to, we would talk to all these people coming in. And at that time, I was doing sort of a fun thing, which was an informal poll among all the people that I was talking to about who they wanted to be the next head of the World Bank. It was at the time when Jeffrey Sachs was in the running, and Summers and everybody. It was kind of wide open. And I found a huge openness to, not only one person said they wanted an American, and it was the guy who's the head of external relations, who likes Jeffrey Sachs. So he was saying he liked Jeffrey Sachs. Every single one, and I talked to a lot of people, said it is time not to have an American head this institution. We need to go in a different direction. They were sort of whispering this, and at the same time, yeah, many of them, you saw two flows of people going in there. One were Filipinas and South Asian women primarily, who are the administrative staff, the support staff, and who were more reticent to talk much. The professional staff is what Amira just described. A lot of wonderful people who've come here, they're making these huge salaries, whatever, with more independent thinking. It's really interesting. So it's what makes me wonder whether it ever could be turned into a good institution. You think there's that at the bottom, what you've described. There's now Jim Kim at the top, who gets it. So then there's this giant block in the middle between that. And can you bust through that? Or, Amira's going to say a word about alternatives in a minute. And I've always felt that the alternative to the World Bank is no World Bank. I would get rid of it quickly. And it's not to say I'm not for lending in the developing world, but I would do it through much more innovative mechanisms that are smaller, closer to the ground, and so on. But I did sit there when Jim Kim became the president and wondered whether outside pressure, those good people at the bottom, Jim Kim at the top, could ever turn this into an institution that would do more good than harm. And haven't yet seen the path to that, but I think we should be open to anything. Yeah.
Is this neoliberal Washington Consensus order not a failed policy at all? Because the objective is not to encourage development. The objective is to prevent development, because that would constitute competition. That seems to dovetail with the foreign policies of the countries who set it up.
Or just to create dependency and,
Yeah, use it
well,
as a cash
so
cow.
the question is, so to what extent this is all a conspiracy, it's all intended to happen in this way. It's not really a failed or flawed policy, but it's part of the plan, right? I think overall, there is this notion that there should be a core and a periphery, and there's so many books that have described that. Probably Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is the one that comes most to mind, but there's a core, and that core is meant to be where the markets are, where the decisions are made, where the power is held. Right? And the periphery is meant to supply the resources, supply the workers, and essentially be, subservient to the core. And I do think that thinking, I think it infiltrates so much of the decision-making in terms of the international system, particularly international political and economic systems. I think your question is an interesting one, to what extent this is deliberate. You have an answer?
No, I don't have an answer. I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Basically, to complement that, it's basically still the former colonial model.
Right.
I mean, that's mostly the colonial powers,
Right.
the British, the French.
Right.
The French were a big colonial power. And the other question is, what about Angola? Angola has a large supply of oil. And how
Right.
do they stand?
Right. So, we were going to talk a bit about alternatives, and I think there's some really interesting model on alternatives that are, it's a mixed bag as well, but it's just different in terms of the power dynamics. I think, and there are two different areas. One is these sort of new power wielders on the global stage. So many think about China, but it's not only China. It's certainly Brazil, and increasingly South Africa, that are playing a role of lending, financing, particularly large infrastructure development. What's interesting about those models is that, it is without the same conditions of the sort of the economic system. You don't have that same neoliberal model being thrust on developing countries that are receiving loans from Brazil or South Africa or China, for example. They end up being smaller in size, but broader in terms of scope, what people are able to do with those resources, and without the same, level of we must have our advisors in your finance ministry control, right? So I think those models are actually really interesting. Clearly, China, we can talk about, it's a complicated model because there are a lot of questions on the environment and its impact on the environment, as well as on workers and worker rights. So there's still some issues in terms of the strings. There might be smaller strings, but there may still be some threads attached, right? And so it's not all clear. But the other side of the financing is coming from largely oil producers. And I think that's a whole nother model, complicated as well because it's ultimately destroying the planet, right? But it is these large oil producers. So Venezuela, for example, Venezuela has become a huge model. And one of the alternatives to the Bank of the South, it's called, was set up largely with financing from Venezuela due to their oil resources, and bringing together an alternative model where developing countries could access resources without being on this continuous debt trap to the World Bank and IMF, So less conditions and with a goal of ending the cycle of debt. And there have been countries, Argentina, that have actually used that to get the bank and the fund off their backs. I don't know if we can say permanently, but for a considerable period of time, it's been holding. So I think it's a model that we have to look at, but we have to understand ultimately, yeah, it would be great to leave the oil in the ground and protect the planet for future generations, right? So it's not a sustainable alternative in a way that would work for the planet overall. But it is something that I think is offsetting the power of the World Bank and the IMF, these international financial institutions, in a way that I think could force them to actually open up to create a little bit more policy space for different economic models to be advanced. So I think it's still, the jury is still out in the long term, but I think there's some wonderful examples to begin to pay attention to.
Yeah, and just wanting to be self-critical for a moment here. The interesting thing about the bank and fund maybe 7 or 8 years ago, both of them were a little bit falling into obscurity and insignificance. The IMF was doing nothing the only country that it had as a client by 2006 was Turkey. And the World Bank was much smaller, and the dynamics that Amira has just described were beginning to happen. China and other countries were giving loans. And what we as a social movement and our allies in government did is we turned to other issues. We weren't paying much attention to them. Some of our allies in Asia were saying, let's just get rid of the IMF and replace it with regional institutions with no conditions. And there was talk of an Asian version of an IMF, but that would be run by Asians and not have horrible austerity. And there were actually pretty well thought through plans for that, and there was the Bank of the South, and then crisis hit. And the crisis you all remember this, but I just watched Game Change last night, the movie about Sarah Palin and John McCain, and the backdrop to it is the economy is collapsing in the fall of 2008. And it happened all over the world, and all of a sudden the IMF was laying off people. They had a plan to lay off 15% of their staff. All of a sudden, there isn't an alternative in Asia. There isn't a perceived other organized alternative around Europe, and Dominique Strauss-Kahn says, we're here, we're back, and these two institutions all of a sudden got a lot more juice. The World Bank story was more complicated because, as Amira said, some were already going to Brazil, some were already going to China, but it is, that was our moment to be really, I think, putting forward and pushing forward. We had all these proposals for alternatives. Up there on the wall is a book that several of us worked on called Alternatives to Economic Globalization, and it was 24 people from North and South that put forward really a whole new framework of what this could look like. But we stopped spending a lot of time pushing our allies on it. And just one other quick thing on what Scott was saying, did they succeed? The people who push the model of free trade and neoliberalism say that it is the best model for prosperity, for growth, for efficiency. And so part of our critique of them is that they have the wrong goals. We would say our goals are human well-being, the planet, societal well-being, the 99%. And they've totally failed on our values and goals. The group that many of you know, CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, has probably been one of the most interesting places to show that it's also failed on its own goals. So they've done a lot of studies to show that this did not generate growth, certainly in Africa, and that countries being freed of this have done better than the ones under the yoke of it. But I mean, from a different standpoint, I do think you're right. These institutions helped reinforce a model that was very good for the 1%. They were institutions that were great for the 1%. But it's a huge, I'm a little bit, I don't know how Amira's feeling. In the 1990s, another one of those, that bottom photo that says globalize liberation. I actually never really read the slogan. That's a pretty cool slogan. This was a march in April of 2000 down the streets of Washington. I bet many of you were part of it. And we marched, and then we had a big teach-in that night at the Foundry United Methodist Church, which has still not forgiven us for putting 2,000 people in their church. We told them it'd be a medium-sized crowd, but tens of thousands of people were mobilized around these institutions. In September of 2001, we were planning on September 27th to 30th, 2001, to have 150,000 people come to Washington to protest these institutions. And the World Bank and IMF had ordered miles of chain link fence, 30 city blocks they were going to close off from 15th Street over H and down. And we were really, by that time, we were rocking these institutions. And they were feeling the crisis of legitimacy. And then 9/11 happened. And we had these horrible meetings about what to do, and we decided we needed to cancel the protests, that we couldn't. There was the whole question of, putting that kind of taxation on a police force that was concerned with now terrorism and so on. And a lot of people who were going to come from other countries didn't come. And in a way, what was a giant movement, a lot of that energy got shifted into the wall behind you all there, which was the peace movement of the last decade. So these are images from the protests against the Iraq War and the Afghan War and so on. And not until Occupy did that energy come back together again around economic justice issues. And in the meantime, in those 13 years, we could have, I think, given the death blow to the World Bank and IMF in terms of they were discredited and they were irrelevant. And it was the moment to be mobilizing governments around alternative institutions along the lines of what Amira said, and we didn't. And so they're back. And they're still doing harm, and we aren't, by and large, as a society, that mobilized against them. There will be a wonderful protest I encourage you all to come to tomorrow at noon outside the World Bank, and it'll march to Treasury for a financial transactions tax. And Lacey.
So sorry, just to mention something on that. Yes, there will be a large protest tomorrow, 12 p.m. at Murrow Park. Everyone, please come. And there will be also action all throughout the weekend. There's going to be a smaller kind of march to kick off the weekend at 6 p.m. Starting at DuPont Circle this evening. And then on Sunday, we're going to march starting at 3 p.m. at Murrow Park. We're going to slay the beast, the three-headed dragon of the IMF, the World Bank, and the G20. And this is actually what I was going to ask about, because in terms of large kind of mobilizations around economic justice and resistance to globalization, resistance to economic colonialism, there has been actually a large component of the G20 protests that actually is in that direction. And so I guess I was just wondering, as I understand it, the huge, outcome of the G20 protests has been actually to be that boon that John was referring to, which is the refunding almost of the IMF, the re-legitimizing of the IMF, and that came out of the G20 discussions in 2008, 2009. And I was just wondering if you could both mention how the G20 is related. The G20 finance ministers, of course, met yesterday and maybe this morning. I don't know if the schedule was a little unclear looking to me, but of course it's not the big heads of state meeting for the G20, but the G20 finance ministers met here in Washington yesterday.
All right, just to make sure that's all on the microphone, couple of protests to make sure people are aware of. The first is tonight at 6 at DuPont Circle. The second is tomorrow at noon outside the World Bank. And the third is Sunday at 3 outside the World Bank. So come out, come often. That's the one. And then the question on the G20. So, 7 billion people almost now on this planet, right? It started out as the G8, sort of a club of very wealthy, again, rich nations coming together to seek their own interests. People pressured from the developing world, from the global south, and it expanded from the G8 to the G20. But it's still undemocratic and reinforcing the economic model of the international financial institutions, not creating a space really for deviating from that model. That's the problem. It's created another venue, right, taking it outside the annual meetings of these big institutions, but it's still very much controlled by the same geopolitical actors. And I think ultimately will not serve the interests of the majority of people on this planet, will continue to serve the interests of that 1%. So ultimately, yes, it's better that it has expanded, but we need to expand fully to institutions that actually represent the majority of people on the planet. And the G20 is far from that.
Yeah, and I just say that reinforces a creative tension as we think about the world that is, reflects a little bit of the complexity, which is that for much of the period we've been describing these last 70 years, many of us who cared about people on the planet would have described the world as a world between the rich nations and the poor nations, the North and the South, if you will. And you'll notice that Amira wasn't using those terms. She was using the term the global South versus the global North. I think that part of what happened in the decade of 2000 to 2010 is as the model was becoming delegitimized, the people at the top were looking for ways to legitimize what they were doing. And the shift of the locus of power from this club that you can't make look very diverse when you have 8 countries and they're all headed by white guys and their finance ministers are all white guys and so on, and they meet and say, we're here to talk about the problems of the world. You look at it and it's kind of hard to sell that at a moment when everything's collapsing. So I think the shift, it was a fascinating meeting between Bush and Blair, and then also the French. But Blair came, and they realized, man, we're in trouble. The people are upset. We're in trouble. Let's shift the locus. So G20, the group of 20 countries, the majority of which are, quote, developing countries, although that's a little bit of that's not quite true because the European Union is in there with its 25 members, but it's the big developing countries, Saudi Arabia and China and India and Brazil and so on. But you look at the photo op of it, which is on the front page of the Washington Post, and there are, unlike Bretton Woods, black faces, brown faces. It's a bit of a rainbow in there. And
Still not enough women, but
so there's usually 1 or 2 women in there. Merkel from Germany anchoring the austerity wing. And so you look at it and you see, and yet, of course, our bigger message here, and it came out in the question about the technocrats and the elite of the South, is that there's a global North which represents, and it's no longer just white people. A while ago it was white people, it was the colonial powers, but now it is the elite of the rich countries and some of the poor countries. And there's a global South that includes the 99% that was on McPherson Square and many people in the global South. And we, of course, want to shift the axis of world history towards the latter. And we think that on certain issues like agriculture, boy, if you could just remove all that crap at the top, the World Bank and the IMF and so on, and let the farmers of the world who understand sustainable agriculture, who don't want to use the kind of fertilizers that just blew up a town in Texas, who believe in growing healthy food, and who agree in building local agriculture first and then regional and then national, and you only trade the stuff that we desperately have to have here, like coffee and coke. In the US and Europe with small farmers in the developing world and workers and others, and those alternatives are bubbling up. And the more you can remove the power of these institutions and stifling it through bad policies that create incentives that are good for Monsanto and bad for a small farmer, the more you give the alternatives space. Others, yeah.
What do you think about the Grameen Bank and microlending as an alternative? Because it's often touted as a way to target smallholders and women, but isn't it just dragging them from a struggling informal economy into, a monetary system?
So the question is on microfinance and to what extent the Grameen or other models are the solution. And ultimately, that's a very minor, I think. I don't think we can see it as particularly in certain countries that are dependent on one commodity. When the price of that commodity drops, farmers are not able to actually repay the loans, even if it's microfinance loans. And so what you have, and India is probably the harshest model of farmers essentially committing suicide because they're unable to deal with the burden of this debt. It sounds great, microfinance, get everyone, and there are wonderful ways where you can use the cell phones and do your cell phone banking and all the rest. But ultimately, to lift people's livelihoods, it will take a comprehensive strategy where people's power is enhanced. And fundamentally, we need to think about an overall system that helps to provide education, healthcare, housing, those essential building blocks of healthy societies. That's what's needed, not a microfinance loan, right? But fundamentally, you need governments. You need governments to be able to tax, particularly resource-rich countries, need to be able to tax companies that are benefiting from the richness of their land. And ultimately, it is the taxation that can go into education, into healthcare, into housing. And that's what will bring an improved livelihood for people. But if we continue a cycle where the resources are basically stolen, the land is raped, essentially, and the government is not able to extract rents, essentially, not able to extract proper concession agreements for the resources, you will continue a cycle where you're on this, again, it's a treadmill of dependence on these external institutions where you're continuously getting loan after loan, even if the loan gets canceled, as it was in the case of Liberia, thankfully, because of people pressure to cancel that debt, right? But even in cases where the debt has been canceled, it will likely be renewed. The cycle will continue again unless you're able to change the model where the resources can actually meet the interests of the people on whose land those resources lie. Fundamentally, it's not microfinance, it's a bigger plan.
Yeah, I just one thing to add. I'll never forget, out of all the protests of the late 90s, one of the ways that people responded and people at the World Bank and IMF responded is they did open up to the notion of having debate. And there were lots of interesting debates that we all had with them. But the one that sticks in my mind on this issue was the head of the World Bank on a screen. This was done virtually. It was one of the first things like this. On a screen with the head of the Grameen Bank, Mohammed Yunus. And they just jump right into it. And they're both lending institutions. They're both called banks. And the commentator asks the head of the World Bank to describe what he does. And then he asks Yunus to describe what he does and what the average size of his loan is. And you're looking at the two faces, and he describes it, and then he says $60. Average size of the loan, $60. The World Bank guys just said, average size of the loan, $123 million. And the World Bank guys, his jaw just drops. It's the notion of $60, that you could do anything with $60. So I so agree with everything Amira just said, and I would add that one of the big critiques of the World Bank and IMF is when you're giving money at that scale, $123 million, there's almost nothing you can do that will work at that level that won't involve all sorts of layers of corruption and more people getting hurt than are helped. And with $60, you can do a lot, but it has to be in the right system, in the right framework, and the right everything. So I know there's another new person here, and then we can go back to Mike.
Subsidies of major European North American countries that sort of impact the local economy to compete. And if you can't, how can you make a demand on a country to increase their capacity, to increase their efficiency without addressing the reason that they can't compete in the first place?
So
how would they dance away from it?
That's a wonderful question about subsidies in the global north, right? And subsidies to rich countries. And I think it's the incredible irony because the subsidies that the U.S. have given to U.S. and this is in the U.S. small farmers, this isn't the black farmers who've been fighting for their rights for generations. No, this is large agricultural companies that are benefiting from these subsidies. And so, no, the institutions have not questioned the ability of the wealthy countries to subsidize their own industries or their own agriculture. It's almost seen as like a given, right? But for other countries, it's a taboo. And it's that irony that makes the system so incredibly imbalanced and flawed. And I think I think it's important to keep calling out those inherent contradictions within how countries are treated. Again, core, periphery, depending on where they fall in that spectrum.
Yeah, and the key thing there is, I mean, I've heard people in the World Bank make noises about not liking agricultural subsidies in Europe and the U.S., but they don't have any power over the U.S. and Europe, because if you're not borrowing from them, they can't press you to do things. And that's why the Declaration of Independence of Argentina and Bolivia and Ecuador and Venezuela and so on was so important and so strong. They just said, we're paying you off. And it was great to watch the solidarity in Latin America of the bigger countries helping the poorer countries pay off their debts. Because at that moment now, Argentina, now is it a perfect democracy? No, but it can set its subsidies the way it wants for its people, and it's all the independence. Whereas most African nations, when the crisis hit, were thrown back into the arms of these institutions.
Especially for the African countries, there's now this added problem of land grabs, where financing from the World Bank is actually encouraging land grabs. Large institutional investors from Europe and the U.S., including some academic institutions, unfortunately, are heavily investing in really the appropriation of land for the production of biofuels, heavily financed by the World Bank. So what you're having is, farmers that are already at the brink now essentially being tossed off their land as the biofuel industry comes to access that land, financed by the World Bank, right, and other international investors. This is a major problem that's going to cause even greater instability, particularly in food and agriculture, but will cause economic crises even more down the road as people are forced off their land, now becoming source of cheap labor in capital cities. Capital cities having major problems because there's no manufacturing. It's the same conversation here, no manufacturing. And so people are now, being forced to be economic migrants. They are victims of trafficking as women, and all of these consequences that are almost unseen, but consequences of World Bank financing on countries, particularly in Africa, that have the last remaining arable land on the planet. So the consequences now and into the future for particularly, the farming sector is 70% of the population, and so if you have those masses of people unemployed, underemployed, and their land stripped away, often ancestral land stripped away, when is the bank and when will those, especially those who are well-intentioned within those institutions, going to take an honest assessment at the impacts of their policies?
Yeah, maybe here, Mike and Farah.
A lot of your discussion about all these institutions doesn't really get to the nub of the question that all of them operate under the principles of capitalism.
Yeah.
In other words, the maximization of profit, the accumulation of capital, all that sort of stuff. And so you can have more benign capitalist institutions, you can have more fascistic capitalist institutions, but they all have that underlying, we've got to make a profit, and maybe we'll reduce our profits a little bit to feed a few people here or there. But that economic model, doesn't work. It fundamentally does not work. We have, billions of people on the planet that are, impoverished by it, and we have a handful of people on the planet that are doing pretty well. Until you challenge that basic, I told John this, we should have a discussion about, is there an alternative to the capitalist way of organizing social life and the social relations of capitalism? Until we get to that discussion, I don't think a lot of this other stuff will make a big amount of difference, basically. I think the capitalists will continue to rule the world, and they'll continue, when threatened by little uprisings here or there, they'll toss a few crumbs. But when things settle down, they go back to, their old practices. And I think, the instance of China emerging as a major world power. Basically, it's an imperialist power. I mean, it has a little different route than the U.S. that maybe it's not going to establish bases in Africa, but it's clearly coming to dominate those economies through its infrastructure investments, and probably only come more so. And eventually, there's going to be a collision between a rising China and a declining West, and it could easily erupt into a war, and literally an awful lot of people could be killed. And until we get to the root of the problem, which is the competition of capitalist systems fighting each other, and make a commitment, we're going to get rid of that. And it's not going to be done by the technocrats of the world. It's going to be made by the workers of the world, because they're the 99%. We'll accept some allies among the technocrats, and they're going to help us out, but fundamentally it's the working class that's going to be the force that transforms this world. And we should get on working on figuring out how to do that.
I'll just say one thing. Mike ran one of the best libraries in the world, which was at McPherson Square, Occupy DC, and there were a lot of books about capitalism in it. And I was thinking about this, I'll just say, when reading, in today's Washington Post, there's a long story about the World Bank and Jim Kim. And it actually points out a fascinating capitalist dilemma that the World Bank is facing now, which is it gets its money from governments originally, but basically it runs off of making the money off of its loans. And so Jim Kim has said our new mandate is the bottom 40% of the world, and the article points out that, so it runs as a capitalist institution but with government support, and you can't make a lot of money off the bottom 40% of the world. So he actually acknowledges this and says, so we're going to keep on the track of giving these loans to China and so on and so forth that will help pay for the institution. But yeah, I agree with, and the interesting thing, Hugo Chavez just died, and the new election in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez was the guy who, more on a global scale, put forward an alternative model and used his oil money, the great contradiction, the oil money that will destroy the planet, to finance the spread of a different model. In places like Bolivia and Ecuador and even small countries like El Salvador and Nicaragua. And I feel like there's more of a moment now of challenging that dominant capitalist model than there has been in the past 10 years because of the dynamism in Latin America, largely. Farah?
Yeah, in the shadow of the World Bank and the IMF, there's also been this notion of the right to development, what the UN has discussed, subversive ideas like the right to food, the right to housing, education, healthcare. I'm wondering, as we look at alternatives, we talk about how nowadays the 99%, the 1%, these are terms that are becoming more ubiquitous. But I find that language like the right to food and housing, I'm wondering, when will it be that moment when we start using those terms to really speak about what's going on the ground? And just to flesh that out for you is just the case study for me that I think we should all be looking out for, which is Egypt, and how Egypt was so inspirational to the Occupy movement, to students in Wisconsin, the whole idea of resistance. And now in Egypt, even with the relatively democratic IMF loan, and so now there seems to be some pushback from that on the ground, but I'm also wondering, with the larger question of how to promote this human rights-based approach to development, is how we can support Egyptians on the ground in resisting.
Well, the Brotherhood was instituted by the British, so you have to start from there.
The joy of a wonderful audience here, and I think on so many levels, on the question of capitalism, and the crisis in capitalism, I absolutely agree with John that this is a moment now to begin to articulate and vision alternate approaches and to voice it. I think there is a turning point for workers really around the world, and I think creating the space where through trade unions expanding their voice, clearly all of the protests actions over the last 2 years, trade unions have played a critical role, understanding that it's that combination of young people, of technology, of trade unions, of arts and culture and music and poetry, all of that it's pushing a different vision of the world. And I think ultimately that's what's needed to be able to voice a different economic model. And clearly the capitalist model has not worked for the majority of people on this planet. And I think the more we can embrace that, and I applaud those who are organizing the Left Forum, make sure that that's on everybody's schedules in New York, because it's an opportunity to have those kinds of conversations. How do we articulate a world where crony capitalism has failed, and how do we envision what comes next in a way that benefits all on this planet? I think the questions of Egypt are really critical, and I applaud Rick Rowden, who was one of those marching with us there outside the World Bank about a decade ago, has just written a wonderful article on Egypt and why Egypt should say no to the IMF loan. I think it is really appalling that it's almost business as usual, unfortunately, that both in terms of the military assistance that flowed from the U.S. and in terms of the economic model, it's almost as if, people's lives that were lost in Tahrir Square were sort of denigrated, So I think it will take, though, more people taking to the streets to say no. This is not our vision of liberation. We aren't there yet. And I think those voices are still there. And it's, again, largely young people and women and trade unions. But their voices are there. And I think they are continuously trying to find spaces, right, where they can assert their power, their influence, not only on Egypt and the region, but really on other movements around the world. I do think it will take a global movement forward of peoples, of workers, of environmentalists, of those who are, part of the local food movement and those who are part of the, no big banks movement. It's a range of us coming together, staying connected, and invigorating each other. So ultimately, I'm excited that so many people are here this weekend from around the world, right? Because I think, people come to protest, they come to engage in different ways, but they are inspiring each other, right? To begin to envision a world that works for the needs of the majority on this planet. And ultimately, I think that's what's needed. Whether right to development, absolutely. But it's demanding a different way other than the status quo, is demanding that people are put first, not corporations, not corporate power. It's demanding that the planet is considered in decision-making of economic well-being for all, right? I think it's those basic core principles that as progressives we have upheld. We have helped to reinforce and envision that we have to wrap up even more so today.
Yeah, and maybe just add one thing. First of all, on Egypt, you are all invited at 2 p.m. Our ally, one of our favorite allied groups, the Third World Network, is bringing a couple of Egyptians here from the NGO networks to talk about what's going on in Egypt and the story that Farah just, fill out the story that Farah just laid out. So we're going to end up here in the next 2 to 3 minutes and have a 15-minute space between now and then. But I urge you all to stay for that. On the rights question, one other way to think of the last 30 years is that it was a period of a giant battle between two sets of rights. One was the rights of corporations, being more deeply enshrined by the WTO and regional trade agreements and the World Bank and IMF, and corporations, in essence, getting more power and more rules with bite. So there's the rights of corporations. And then on the other hand, the rights, you mentioned, to food, to water, to development, including housing and so on. And another big thing, I think some of you participated about 5 years ago, there was a giant gathering in Bolivia where 35,000 people came together around a document on the rights of, they called it the rights of Mother Earth in Bolivia, which was then presented by 10 NGO leaders and Evo Morales to the Secretary General of the UN. It's an incredible document. So actually, in a way, there has, and the water warriors around the world have lifted up the right to water and again, got the UN General Assembly to pass some new things on the right to water. But if you look at them side by side, what you see is that one of them has been given the rights of corporations, all this enhanced power in the last 30 years, and the others have been further developed. They're clearer, we know better what we want, but they don't have as much power. And one way to think of the next 30 years is we've got to reverse that. And I've become more and more convinced that the way to reverse it is to remove the rules that give so much power to the corporations. It's not that we want all these regimes that enhance the right to water. We want peoples at the community level and national level to embrace it and to pass laws that protect it and to advance it and to hold off corporations. And we want to make sure that the World Bank and the IMF and the big global institutions can't undermine that. And that's really, in many ways, the central challenge. We've got the roadmap. We have the actors. They're being impeded by this imbalance. And I would hope, as Mike has said, and as we began with, that that back to the period, the big period, 50s to 80s, the fight was between socialism and capitalism. That was the big global fight. And with the end of the Berlin Wall and the rise of Reagan, Thatcher, Kohl, and the World Bank and IMF, we shift to, people like Francis Fukuyama saying the end of history, we just have one system. We're back now into a different ballgame. And it's not hopefully going to be capitalism versus one other thing. It's hopefully going to be a lot of different options, a lot of different possibilities. And with it bubbling up through agriculture and through many other means that we've described here. But that's the bigger challenge. And I'm just aware, here at IPS, Amira and I have focused a lot of our energies on this over the last long time. But I just wanted to mention there's two other cores of activity here. One is our Global Economy Project headed by Sarah Anderson, has in the last 4 years brought a lot of great people into the IMF to beat them up on something that Amira said at the beginning, which is their opposition to countries being able to control capital flows in and out of their countries, something that really hampered countries during the financial crisis. And they've so beaten up the IMF. I mean, I applaud this. It's an inside strategy that the IMF has backed off in its opposition to capital controls. And the other is Janet Redman and Daphne Weisham, who lead our environment work here. They started this great work about 20 years ago that pointed out that the World Bank, despite claiming to want to save the planet, was at that time giving over 100 times more to fossil fuels loans than to clean energy loans. And they have beaten those institutions up year in and year out. The ratio's down to maybe 10 to 1 now. Jim Kim claims that the biggest problem in the world, other than the bottom 40%, is climate change. And so, again, the debate has shifted. And we encourage you to join any of these pieces of our work. And I'm going to give the last word to Amira, and then we can have an informal chat for any of you who want to stick around, and please do stay for the Egypt piece.
Well, I feel like we've said so much already. I just want to applaud you for being here, those here in person, those online, those watching later on the web, because I do think this is a critical moment. And the more we come together to hear what's happening around the world, both within institutions and in the streets, the inside-outside strategy, the more we're able to inspire each other. And so I think often as IPS as being that, where you sort of, head inspirers, right, to encourage you to seize your power. Yeah, seize your power as students and young people who are visioning this better world that we know it's possible. Seize your power whatever way you can in what you decide to commit to as your research activities, as your academic studies advance. Seize your power in what you're able to influence for your community of fellow activists, whether it's your campus or other associations that you're a part of. I think it's collective power, people power, that has made the difference in the world, that has brought change from the days, if you think about it, of the slave trade, which was, again, it was an economic system benefiting a very narrow 1%, right? That actually dehumanized people and continued for decades. But it took people demanding a different way. And ultimately, the scourge of the slave trade was ended. The scourge of slavery was ended, not fully, and there's still some vestiges in certain countries, but largely because people stood up and demanded a different way. And whether it's that or, issues around the civil rights era here in the U.S., the anti-apartheid struggle, ending white rule in South Africa, liberation struggles around the world, what's happening in Latin America today with governments and movements standing firm. Clearly, all the stuff around Egypt and Tunisia and the 20 other African countries that have had similar protests over the last 2 years. These are extraordinary efforts by people to demand and then to bring about change. And, this weekend, come out to the protests. In the fall, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of IPS, and it happens to also coincide with the meeting of the World Bank and IMF. Join us then as well for protests, for analysis, for advocacy. There are so many ways in which you can seize your power. I applaud you for seizing the moment to be here with us today, and I encourage you to seize your power in the days, years,